Okay, assalamu alaikum. Thank you everyone for coming. This is my third visit to Malaysia, and I'm hoping after my remarks this afternoon it won't be my last visit to Malaysia, because you can never be sure in the age of authoritarianism what will happen to you. These are the dark days of the Islamic world. It's a very bleak picture. I know Malaysians are facing their own struggles with respect to democracy and human rights and the attempt to create a just government. And I'm here to support those efforts, and I'm happy to offer these remarks on the topic that brings us here together: is liberty an Islamic value? Let me begin by clarifying the term liberty. I'm going to use it interchangeably with the term freedom. In the English language, there is a subtle difference. In the history of Western political thought, there is a difference between the concepts of freedom and liberty. One prominent philosopher in Britain, a very distinguished philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, delivered a series of lectures in the late 1950s that were published in a book called Two Concepts of Liberty. If we were having an academic seminar, I would go into some of the differences between liberty, its different components, and freedom, but for the sake of this lecture, I'm going to be using the terms freedom and liberty interchangeably. So, as was sort of mentioned in the introductory remarks, there are many people around the world, both Muslim and non-Muslim, who firmly and passionately believe that the concept of freedom does not exist within Islam, not within its theology, its doctrine, its historical experience, its civilizational ethos, its inner ethical tradition, etc. In the West today, sadly, many people, due to the turmoil in the Middle East and due to their own biases that are very deep-rooted with respect to Islam and Muslims, firmly believe that Islam and freedom are oxymorons. They are opposites. They have nothing to do with one another. There's lots of survey data that actually proves this argument, and Donald Trump has exploited it to get elected and to stay in office. I don't want to deal with that aspect of the topic. I want to deal with the other aspect of the topic that was alluded to a moment ago. In Muslim societies today, there is also a very large and growing constituency of people who have negative views toward the concept of freedom and view the concept of freedom or liberty with an equal amount of skepticism, disdain, and rejection. These Muslims believe that God has established his rules and codes of behavior in the Quran, and the Prophet Muhammad is the living embodiment of these verses, and our learned scholars have explained and interpreted the verses, and all that is left to do for a believing Muslim is to follow the rules and the commandments enunciated by God, and everything will be fine. End of story, khalas. In this view of Islam, there is no freedom to choose. One simply has to obey. In this view of Islam, a Muslim does not need to think or debate about what is good or bad, what is virtuous or ethical. He or she simply needs to follow the already established rules and codes of Islam and implement them as rigorously and as faithfully as possible, particularly focusing on the rituals of Islam, and if you do that, then everything will be fine. In this view of Islam, the concept of freedom is synonymous with moral decay, moral perversion, decadence, chaos, the breakdown of social and political order. And so thus some Muslims conclude that it's best to avoid freedom altogether and to stick to Islam as understood and interpreted traditionally over time by the learned scholars and those people who are in authority. Now let me state very clearly and very emphatically that I strongly disagree with this interpretation of Islam. While I respect those Muslims who have this interpretation of Islam to abide by it, my understanding and interpretation of Islam is different, and I believe there is an alternative interpretation that is much more valid and much more in keeping with the overall moral trajectory and arc of the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, that can lead one to a different interpretation and understanding of the relationship between freedom and Islam. So in my remarks, I want to share with you a series of really scattered remarks that I've been thinking about over the last 2 weeks when Farouk gave me this topic to think about. And I'm very interested in hearing from the other panelists in terms of what they have to say. But I want to begin by clearly stating my position. My answer to the question, is liberty an Islamic value, is a resounding yes. So let me sort of articulate my argument. Now, I had a PowerPoint presentation, and it's up there. Thank you very much. So my argument begins with the following. Freedom, or liberty, is actually central to Islam. And in fact, it is inbuilt within the DNA of Islam. And a full commitment to Islam as a religion demands that you accept the concept of freedom. To deny or reject the concept of freedom is to fundamentally misread, and I think to fundamentally misinterpret Islam. More specifically, in order to live up to the ideals of Islam as embodied in the Quran and in the Hadith, you actually can best live up to those ideals if you live in a free society where there is a relative absence of state interference and societal coercion that promotes the free exercise of religion. In other words, if you're living in a coercive authoritarian state where you're forced to behave and forced to believe, that produces religious hypocrisy. And that, I don't think, is in anyone's interest. It's certainly not in the interests of the Quran. Some of the harshest language in the Quran is reserved for the hypocrites, people who act hypocritically. And so, if you're living in a society that guarantees basic social and political freedoms, then I think you can live a more Islamic lifestyle. I'm strongly of the view that you can be a better Muslim living in Canada, for example, than you can living in the Islamic Republic of Iran or in Saudi Arabia, because there is the existence of various legally guaranteed social freedoms that allows one to pursue their faith. Now, this observation might shock many people, but it's also quite revealing. It tells us quite a bit about the dark days of the Islamic world, where you can be a better Muslim if you're living in Canada or if you're living in some parts of the West than you can in many Muslim majority countries. That's a sad commentary, but I think it's an accurate commentary on the state of the Muslim world today. And so my second argument is that while I strongly believe that freedom is absolutely essential to Islam, every society has limits on how much freedom they're willing to tolerate. No society allows an absolute and unregulated amount of freedom. All societies place limits on freedom, and these limits vary over time. In democratic societies, people decide and debate what the boundaries of freedom are. There's always controversies over the question of freedom. In the West, there is a long history of banning books, banning speakers over the question that their attempt to express their views and to exercise their freedom of expression offends some other community. And there's many examples that one can cite, and I'd be happy to go into those examples. Just to cite one famous one, there was a very famous case in the 1940s in the city of New York when the most distinguished philosopher and intellectual of the first half of the 20th century, a man by the name of Bertrand Russell, was given a teaching position at the college, one of the colleges in the city of New York. And there was a protest and a series of complaints that were directed against him because his teachings, his views, his opinions on marriage, his views on religion were deemed to be very offensive to people in the city of New York. And he was actually fired from his position. And so the broader point here is that while I take a stand, and I'm very supportive of the concept of freedom. I realize that all societies, as I just said a moment ago, go through these debates and discuss and entertain arguments over what the proper limits of freedom are, and often people's basic civil rights, their human rights, their rights to free expression are violated. And so in that sense, Muslim societies today who are struggling with this topic of the relationship between their religion and freedom are going through a series of trials and experiments that are not that different from Western society. We often tend to think that the West has always been perfect and ideal, and they've never had these controversies. Well, think again. Anyone who's familiar with the history of the topic will know what I'm talking about. Now, if I can go to the next slide, number 3. One of the issues that comes up within Muslim societies over this question of freedom and its relationship to Islam and Muslims who live within Muslim societies, and it gets lots of global attention, is this deep tension between freedom of expression on the one hand and the protection of sacred religious beliefs on the other. Muslims generally, when asked, will say yes to freedom of expression. We deeply believe in it, but no when it comes to trying to exercise that freedom to offend the sacred symbols of Islam, the Quran, the Prophet. And this relates to the controversial topic of blasphemy, the act of defaming the sacred. And this is a big problem that exists today in Muslim societies. It has existed historically in the West as well. There was a recent, actually, very interesting debate and manifestation of this topic in the context of the constitutional writing process in Tunisia. After the Arab Spring, when the dictator was toppled and Tunisians got together to debate a new blueprint, a new constitution, inevitably the question of freedom of expression came up, and the question of the limits of freedom of expression was also articulated. And this became a point of deep contention among the constitutional delegates. And so Article 6 of the Tunisian constitution wrestled with this. And some of the Muslim delegates coming from the Ennahda party were very much interested in having a provision in the penal code and in the constitution that would limit the right to engage in what was perceived to be an act of blasphemy. This went back and forth among the delegates. Some of the constitutional members called other constitutional members un-Islamic for articulating a defense of a very expansive view of freedom of expression. And at the end of the day, despite the intense debates, a broad consensus was arrived at in and among the constitutional delegates that there would not be a blasphemy law, there would not be a provision in the criminal code to criticize someone if they engaged in what was perceived to be blasphemy, because doing so, it was argued, and I think rightfully, was that doing so could lead to the abuse of power. Who is fundamentally going to determine whether someone has engaged in an act of blasphemy? There's deep dangers in doing so. As a compromise, the Constitution of Tunisia included a provision that called for the protection of religion as a founding constitutional principle, and how those issues will become reconciled if ever there is a perceived sense that someone has offended the sacred sensibilities of Tunisian Muslims. Well, the independent courts will have to wrestle with that particular topic. And I think that broadly is, I think, a fair balance to strike. And so this issue of blasphemy is a big problem in Muslim societies. It's often used, as many of you people will know, to persecute and to punish minority populations living in different Muslim countries. In neighboring Indonesia, some of you might recall that the courts in Indonesia recently convicted Jakarta's governor for the perceived sense of blasphemy. And what was his crime? He was rebuked and he was criticized by clerics in Indonesia for calling on Muslims to vote for him. And when some clerics made the argument that no, Muslims should only vote for Muslim candidates, he pushed back against that argument, and he was perceived to have committed an act of blasphemy, and this is currently in the court system. And this has become an example of the abuse of power. That if you have a blasphemy law, it can often lead to the abuse of power and the taking away of basic rights of citizens, particularly if they're members of a minority community. So let me go to the next slide, number 4. And one of my arguments, as I started to think about this question of freedom and its relationship to Islam, is actually the concept of freedom, if you think about it, is actually foundational to the story of human creation that is in the Quran. According to the Quranic narrative reported in the 2nd chapter of the Quran and elaborated in other parts of the text, human beings are created after God consults with his angels about the selection of a representative on earth. And the angels in this story object. And they tell God that if you create this human being, he's going to spread mischief and he's going to spread chaos in the world. And God responds that, I know what you don't know, sort of hinting that the potential of human goodness is also part of the human potential. And the angels simply don't understand that, and so God pushes back. And related to this story in the Quran, there is a related passage where God asks the angels then to bow down to the first human being that is created, the figure of Adam. And one particular entity refuses to bow down. He's referred to as Iblis, or Satan, in the Holy Book. And Iblis argues that I'm superior to the human being. And he acts in a very arrogant way. He refuses to bow down. He refuses God's commandment. And that's when the story of this deep and ongoing moral tension and struggle that is within that is the main moral struggle for all human beings begins according to the Quranic story. A dynamic is set up from this moment on where the basic foundation and the basic moral challenge facing humanity revolves around this struggle between goodness and the temptations of Satan, and Muslims are sort of going to be tested on how they respond to this fundamental moral challenge. So the eternal challenge facing human beings, according to this Quranic story, really revolves around the path of goodness that is prescribed by the Quran and his prophets, and then the path of evil or the temptations of Satan. And in this struggle, God clearly states in the Quran that he is on the side of human beings, provided that he or she makes the necessary effort to follow the Quranic injunctions and rulings. And if human beings take a step in the direction of God's commandments and that which is right and that which is just, they will be rewarded. So the key point here, right from the very foundation of the story of human creation in the Quran, is the question of freedom. The Quranic story of human creation is connected to the topic or the concept of freedom because we are told right from the beginning that human beings have a choice. They have a free choice and they have an independent free will to follow the path of righteousness, to follow the path that God has prescribed, or to be subjected to the temptations of Satan. Human beings, we're told time and time again in the Quran, are personally responsible for the choices that they make, and that they will be held accountable for their choices on the day of judgment, the Yom al-Qiyamah. Thus, to ignore the concept of freedom is to, in fact, reject the very basic moral challenge that God has set up for all of humanity. And as the late Islamic scholar Fazlur Rahman has written, the Quran rejects the concept of absolute determinism of human behavior. Denying free choice on the part of man is not only to deny the entire content of the Quran, but to undercut its very basis. The Quran, by its own claim, is an invitation to man to come to the right path. Hudan linnas is the phrase that is used. And so the existence, without the existence of freedom, without the existence of free choice, you simply cannot understand the basic story of human creation and the basic sort of challenge that faces all human beings from an Islamic perspective. There's also numerous other passages in the Quran where religion is explicitly stated is a free choice for people to adopt. Let there be no compulsion in religion. La ikra'a fid-din. The Quran also says in other places, in a very famous statement in chapter 13, God does not change the condition of a people unless they change it themselves. And there's other sort of statements along this line, all of which imply that people have a choice to make, that freedom is the background and the context. And of course, the very famous prophetic statement that every Muslim is taught growing up, and of which all Muslims agree upon, this very famous prophetic injunction that Muslims should seek knowledge unto China, presupposes that you have the freedom to go to China to seek knowledge. So this concept of freedom is so foundational that it strikes me that people would be opposed to it. It simply does not, at least, cannot be reconciled with a basic, fundamental, and honest reading of the Quran. If I can go to the next slide, I'd like to move forward. If you follow the story of the early Muslim community, the story of the Prophet Muhammad, when he begins to articulate his message in Meccan society after he receives revelation, it's deeply connected to the question of freedom. He had the freedom to debate, to discuss, to convert people. And when that freedom is constricted, and when oppression starts to increase, the Prophet migrates to Medina. And you can read the story of migration as a story that validates the concept of freedom. The Prophet moves from Mecca to Medina. He undertakes the hijrah in many ways because his freedom is constricted in Mecca, and in Medina it's guaranteed. And when he establishes his early Muslim state or community, it's based on the existence of freedom of religion for non-Muslims. It's based on the ability to articulate, to discuss, to debate. And so the question of freedom is also very foundational to the early story and the life of the Prophet Muhammad. And if you also think about the expansion and the spread of Islam in its early expansion in the first few centuries, Islam expands and it converts new people based on the existence of at least a relative amount of freedom to discuss and convert people. Had it not been for the existence of freedom, then those early attempts to expand and to promote Islam would not have been available. And if you think about the glory years, these early phases of early Islamic history, the golden age of Islam, the period in Andalusia in southern Spain when Islamic civilization in many ways was at its zenith, and where there was this, melting and meeting of different cultures and religions, of which Islam was a major part of, that was based on the existence of freedom. People were allowed to debate, learn, acquire knowledge, contribute to human civilization, to think and engage with others, and that's how Islamic civilization became one of the great world civilizations, because of this existence of a relative amount of freedom. Had it not been the case, one could not envision the rise and the expansion of Islam as a civilizational force. So now everything that I've said up until now is relatively non-controversial. I think one of the big challenges facing Muslims today in thinking about the question of freedom really has to do with the challenge of modernity. Modernity has imposed new challenges and new questions, and I think this is where the anxiety and the concern and the fear that some Muslims have with respect to freedom begins to set in. The challenge of the rise of Europe, the challenge of the scientific revolution, the legacy of imperialism and colonialism has all created a set of deep anxieties for Muslim communities when they think about the question of freedom in a modern context. And so I can go to the next slide. I want to quote from one of the great Canadian scholars of Islam, the late Wilfred Cantwell Smith, in his classic book written over 50 years ago, made the following observation that I think still holds today. Wilfred Cantwell Smith famously said, in the context of the modern Muslim struggle with modernity, that the fundamental malaise of modern Islam is a sense that something has gone wrong with Islamic history. The fundamental problem of modern Muslims is how to rehabilitate that history, to set it going again in full vigor so that Islamic society may once again flourish as a divinely guided society should and must. The fundamental spiritual crisis, Cantwell Smith said, of Islam in the 20th century stems from this awareness that something has gone off course between the religion that God has appointed and the historical development of the world in which he controls. Now, this topic of Islam's relationship to modernity is a vast one, it's a deep one. We don't have time to adequately explore it in the context of today's meeting. But I want to draw upon one particular book that has made an argument about Islam and modernity that bears on this question of freedom that I read as a young student, that actually stuck with me, and that has some insight that I want to share with you because it has a bearing on this topic. Actually, the author of the book spent 3 years in Malaysia teaching at the Islamic University as a philosopher in the 1990s. He had a very negative experience here, and he had a crisis of faith. But he did write a book that I think is quite valuable. I would put this book on anyone's reading list if they want to think seriously about the topic that the book is about. A Faith for All Seasons, Islam and the Challenge of the Modern World. And this is a fascinating book because it tries to draw attention to this particular moment in history that poses a challenge for Muslims related to two broad themes. Number one, the challenge of secular humanism, and number two, the challenge of ideological pluralism. The author of the book, Shabir Akhtar, makes an argument that few Muslims have recognized the threats of secularity and ideological pluralism that our current circumstance brings. Many a Muslim writer, he says, prefers to pretend that modernity poses a challenge only to Christianity. And it's a threat to Christian and Western societies. Muslims don't have to deal with this particular challenge. And so what Akhtar is arguing in this book, he says that one of the key challenges that modernity poses for all religions, not just Christianity, not just Judaism, but also Islam, is how can religious believers come to terms with the fact that in many parts of the world, mostly in the West, mostly in Europe, and in the United States and Canada, there has been a decline and outright rejection of a religious-centered morality and worldview. And that many people have developed an argument rooted in what's called a secular humanist tradition that claims that you can be a moral person, you can be a just person, and you can be a righteous person without any reference to God. In other words, the argument that is articulated from this secular humanist tradition and poses a challenge to all believers is, can you be a moral atheist? Now, for religious believers, this is a huge challenge. Many people simply answer no, you cannot be a morally just and righteous person unless you have a commitment to God. But there is a worldview that stems out of the legacy of modernization, the Enlightenment tradition, that has produced very, I think, sophisticated, very powerful, and very, in my view, righteous individuals who articulate a worldview that has no reference to the transcendent, no reference to the metaphysical, no reference to God. And so Akhtar in this book says, well, how are Muslims going to respond to this claim? What is the Muslim response? And he poses that as a challenge. And he makes an argument that Muslims have to respond to this particular challenge. The second related challenge that modernity poses for all religious believers, but in this case for Muslims, that Akhtar talks about in this book, is the challenge of ideological pluralism. Our planet is globalized. We are aware of the plurality of human beings on this planet. The old assumptions about human relationships, about social organization, no longer are valid for many people. Everything is open to question and critique. New questions are being asked about what constitutes right and wrong, what's ethical and what's unethical, and previously marginalized groups are now making new demands for recognition. How will Muslims respond to this challenge? The development of freedom, the development of a technological revolution has posed these new challenges for humanity, and Muslims, constituting roughly a quarter of humanity, have to provide a response. What is their response? Shabir Akhtar says in the book that the authenticity of any ideology, and he's talking about Islam in this case, the authenticity of any ideology is not to be judged in advance, but rather in relationship to the capacity it has for overcoming the crises that life produces. Will we remain Muslims if Islam produces more crises than it does overcome? And so he observes that loyalty to Islam is not to be served by isolating oneself from the current contemporary secular opinion. Sooner or later, Islam must, like other monotheistic faiths, face what he calls the tribunal of secular reason and to patiently endure trial by modernity. To the extent that Muslim thought remains entrenched within the forces of dogma, secure in its provincialism, the critic is justified in his suspicion that Muslims secretly fear that Islam is incapable of surviving the ordinary rigors of rationalism, incapable of surviving trial by modernity. Are Islam and his scriptures, he asks, then capable of patiently tolerating disciplined investigation? It's high time for us Muslims to raise our heads above the dogmatic parapet. And if you read the entire book, he says that absolutely, positively, Muslims can respond to the challenge of secular modernity, but it requires debate, discussion, and an atmosphere of freedom to engage in these questions. Some Muslims might choose to hide, Muslims might choose to ignore these debates, but they're going to be asked, they're going to be posed to Muslims, and unless there's an effective response, then I think Muslims are at a huge disadvantage unless they can respond to some of these challenges that modernity poses. And so I don't have time to go into this particular topic in great depth. If you look at the early attempts by Muslim intellectuals to respond to the challenge of secular humanism, it leaves a lot to be desired. And so if someone asks me in the question and answer session, I'd be happy to go into greater detail and analysis of what previous arguments were advanced by Muslim intellectuals in the 19th century and the 20th century as they began to be exposed to the challenges of secular modernity, the challenges of secular humanism. So let me just reiterate one particular sort of final argument or summation of my argument with respect to this topic on liberty and Islam. As I've tried to argue this afternoon, the question of freedom or the question of liberty is deeply connected to the very foundation of Islam. It's deeply connected to the very foundation of the story of human creation. The evolution and spread of Islam. In the United States, for example, where I currently live, you have huge amounts of conversion taking place, particularly among African American populations and particularly in the American prison system. That would not be possible had there not been the existence of freedom. So if you think about the question of Islam and freedom from that perspective, you will realize that they're deeply connected. Right now, about 23% of our planet is made up of Muslims. That would not have been possible had there not been an opportunity for Muslims to spread their message, to propagate their vision of humanity, and to accept new followers, to travel, to explore, to debate, to respond to criticism. All of that implies the existence of freedom. I do want to say in the end that I find it deeply problematic and actually outright hypocritical that Muslims demand the right to propagate and to spread Islam for themselves, and they cry foul when this is denied to them, but they don't give the same right to non-Muslims to spread their own ideological position or religious perspective. I mean, that is just nothing but outright, I think, moral hypocrisy, and I think it stems from this argument that Shabir Akhtar is talking about Islam's challenge and its difficulty in coming to terms with some aspects of modernity. The fact that it fears other ideological opinions. It fears that it can't withstand the criticism or withstand the possibility of other people articulating a different worldview. I think that is a huge challenge for Muslims going forward. It's not going to go away, and I think it's one that Muslim intellectuals and Muslim societies are going to have to come to terms with. The sooner, the better. So liberty and freedom, I think, are absolutely essential to the question of Islam. I view the question of freedom in the end as not that different from a television set or the internet. Anything can be used for noble purposes, for righteous purposes, but the same tool can be used for negative purposes. You can use the internet to mobilize, to organize, to educate. You can also use the internet for destructive purposes. And the choice, fundamentally, as to what path and how one uses these tools, in this case the concept of freedom, is up to individual Muslims. They're the ones who have to make the choices, and they're the ones, according to the story that we have in the Quran, who will be held accountable by God for their choices at the end of time. It's not the job of the self-appointed guardians of Islam to make those decisions for other Muslims. Thank you.